I want to very quickly go over the pros and cons of automated testing. And if you do implement automated testing in your program, it does take time up front to write those tests, as I've already said. And when you write those tests, that time you would have taken to write the test is time that you would normally have spent actually going into the browser, typing in things into forms, and so on. So the amount of time up front is not actually that much more than running normal tests, especially if you start having to run the same tests over and over again. If you're running the same tests over and over again in the browser, obviously you need to keep going into the browser, re-entering information into the form and pressing submit and then checking the result. Once you've got that test written, you can just run it over and over again. So what are the advantages of unit testing? Obviously, robustness is the key, and that's the robustness of your software. Anytime you make even the slightest change to your program, you can run your entire suite of tests that check every single function in the program and check that you haven't broken something. And this is important where you have a large scale program where you've got one function that calls another function that calls another function that calls another function. If you break the function at the bottom of that chain, obviously the function at the top of that chain is going to break. So what your tests will do is they'll test every single function in the program at once, and anytime you make a change to something, we'll check you haven't broken something somewhere else in the program. And the second big advantage of a test is that it serves as a piece of documentation. Someone else can go into your test and see a description of how the function is supposed to work. They can see the kind of data that you have to send to it, and then the response or return value that that function will give to that initial data. So they can see it like a documentation page. If you go onto the manual page for a programming language, what do you see? Well, you see an example of calling the function with some test data and then an explanation of what data that would return. And that's the exact same thing you'll get in a test. The test will describe how the function is supposed to work. So someone coming into your project new and doesn't understand how something works can just go and look at the tests and then see how each function should be run. And there's a couple of obvious disadvantages to unit testing. The first one being that obviously you have to spend time up front writing the tests. And I talked about this a few moments ago. That time actually is not as big as it seemed initially, because you have to contrast that with the time that you would normally spend going into the browser, typing things in, clicking to the right page, and so on. So although it does take time, the actual time difference is not going to be very much. The bigger problem though with testing is, how do you know the tests are correct? And how do you know the tests are covering every possibility of the code? For example, the isParse function we looked at in the previous exercise, how do you know you've tested every possible permutation? Would you have to provide the numbers 1 to 100 to check that it's working correctly? So how can you know that the test is correct? And that's something we'll talk about a bit later.